My talk simply has a title here of Climate Security in Focus. I want to get us to focus in on a couple of crucial aspects of it. And so here goes. First and foremost, if you saw the documentary, is it 8 years ago now? The crucial point in this one, that is one of the better documentaries on the topic, is that we are already living in the age of consequences. As Caesar said a moment ago, you're having a warm weather out there in Ottawa. Heat domes, heat events are something that are stressing all sorts of societies. Yesterday's headline from Mecca was particularly alarming, with over 500 deaths from heat-related issues in this year's Hajj. We are seeing disrupted climate, and we are, to use the words in this title, now living in the age of consequences. Does that mean that climate change is going to lead to conflict? I love this graphic. The superimposition of an AK-47 on an oil well says lots. The eerie sky as well says lots in terms of what it is that we might be worrying about for the future. But that said, quite a lot of the scholarly debate in the last few years has asked this simple question. Is climate change likely to cause conflict? And surely the poster child for this debate has to be the Syria case. From much of the literature now is nearly a decade old, but it really focused everybody's attention. The graphic suggests that we may be on the road to an ever more obscure, dust-filled, conflictual future. But in careful scholarly reflection on all of this, the answer to this question is, well, not really. Climate was clearly an issue in terms of disruptions of agricultural production in Syria 15 years ago or thereabouts, 15, 14, 13 years ago. Clearly, it was a stressor on the agricultural system. But when you actually try to put the causation links from climate to conflict together, it turns out there's all sorts of other things that were going on in Syria. Recently, Josh Busby's book on States and Natures points out that there was actually a worse drought a few years earlier in that region of Syria, and no conflict resulted. So it's not at all clear that the simple focus on climate causing conflict is necessarily the kind of thing that we need to be worried about, although of course it may happen. It's far from the only issue relating climate to conflict and security that we need to address. The complexity of the issue is captured in this recent volume, Climate Change, Conflict, Insecurity. Are we going to have hot wars? And will that then involve all sorts of new United Nations interventions and such things? That's part of the larger discussion of human security, because it's quite clear from Josh Busby and other people that while climate change may not be directly leading to conflict, it's certainly going to lead to all sorts of forms of insecurity. Part of a larger series of transformations that the world is undergoing, and something that we all need to attend to as best we can in the coming years. There's an interesting chapter by Tom Dalianis in this volume. I'm not sure Tom's in the audience today, pointing out that climate is important, but it's not the whole story. And I think it's well worth remembering that, and I'll come back to this later in my talk. Climate is an accelerant, it's a threat multiplier, it's a stressor. All these terms are used in terms of it being important, but it's not the whole story. And do not forget that when you're addressing this topic. But it is clearly what is driving the debate. It's clearly what's got the attention of policymakers, and it's clearly what has got the attention of lots of people. Those of you who walked to the hotel, as Caesar said a few minutes ago, are being just part of a much broader audience addressing these things. I guess the moment at which this really crystallized for me was this week 23 years ago, when I first began to think seriously about the Arctic and what climate was doing to make all sorts of people in various places insecure. I was 260 something or other kilometers north of the Arctic Circle in Inari in Finland. What else do you do in June other than visit northern parts? I was there by a series of interesting circumstances at I believe it was then the Second World Congress of Reindeer Herders of the World. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because one of the things at that Congress was the reindeer herders around the Arctic Circle, Russian, Canadians, and some Americans, obviously a whole bunch of Finns, the Sami, were, of course, worried, very worried about what climate change was back then in 2001 already doing to the reindeer, caribou, we might call them, migration patterns. And the crucial question was, how do we herd our animals if they're not showing up where we expect them to, given their historical patterns of migration around the region? Already climate change had disrupted the vegetation patterns already back in 2001. This was causing major problems for not just the Sami, the local folks in Nari, but across the Arctic. And that was one of the discussions. It made me realize that, climate change is already here. We've been talking about it as a matter for the future back in the 90s. But by 2001, in the Arctic at least, it was already here. And of course, the Arctic has been heating more rapidly and changing more rapidly than many other parts of the world, even if the total human impact, of course, is less because the populations are relatively sparse around the Arctic. Nonetheless, what this does suggest is that we are well and truly into climate change, because back 23 years ago, it was quite clear already that that was an issue affecting directly the livelihoods of folks in that part of the world. A few years later, it came to everybody else's attention because suddenly in 2007, the ice across the Arctic Ocean dramatically reduced in area and volume. And everybody suddenly panicked because they suddenly realized actually the Arctic is changing. We may end up with a situation where the Arctic is ice-free in the foreseeable future. There have been various predictions ever since about which year it's actually going to happen, but clearly the trend is there. I was chatting to a modeler about 2008 or 2009, because of course none of the models had predicted this loss of ice, and said to him, well, look, what did you miss? Why is it that the much vaunted computer power of all these models didn't get this prediction anywhere close to right? And he sort of looked at me and he said, well, Eastern Siberia never had a pattern of northern blowing winds in summer. It just never happened before, so it wasn't in the model, so it caught us all by surprise. And I think that this is the second lesson that we need to learn. The models are all very well up to a point, but because we live in a climate disrupted world, surprises and things that are difficult to predict, precisely because they haven't happened before, are the world in which we live, and we need to work that into our considerations about what it is that climate has to do with security. This shouldn't be a surprise for security thinkers. They're supposed to think about surprises, in all sorts of different military and diplomatic contexts and be prepared for it. But I think it's worth remembering that predictions are tricky, particularly when you're dealing with anomalous, novel phenomena, like, for instance, those winds off the north end of Siberia in the summer of 2007. The security folks who pay attention to this worry that the Russians have got a much larger presence in the Arctic than NATO, or in particular Canada. Well, yes, but then they've got a lot more activities going on up there than we've ever had. And so this may not be a matter of great concern. It's a concern if you worry about military facilities and capabilities. But we do have an unfortunate habit in this world of charting new territories using militaries rather than civilian agencies to do it. Nonetheless, clearly the questions of military presence in the Arctic suddenly became a whole lot more interesting if ice turned to water very quickly, unpredictably. Who's up there doing what? The need for surveillance, obviously, in the Arctic is unarguable. given these circumstances. If you're thinking about what that might actually mean, of course, the trade route issue is one of the things that is obviously of concern. Is this going to open up new trade routes across the pole? If the summer ice disappears altogether, are we going to end up with at least a few months when the oceans are accessible to normal traffic? If you're sitting in Shanghai as a shipping broker, trying to figure out which cargo to put on which ship, sending it to Europe, how? Well, this might change things, because if you look at that map, there's a sort of fairly direct route through the Bering Strait, heading straight for Rotterdam or Hamburg, or Newcastle, or, well, any other European port you want to think about. This might actually be a great help, because after all, if you're sitting in Shanghai trying to get stuff on cargo ships to Europe, these days you're worrying about the unreliability of Russian railways, given the conflict in the Ukraine. You're worried about whether the Suez Canal is safe, because the Houthis have a habit of sending rockets at ships going into the Red Sea, because they're annoyed with what the Americans and the Israelis are doing in Gaza. The Panama Canal is a bit dodgy too as a route these days, because there's not enough rain there to fill the reservoirs to allow the canal to operate at full capacity. Wouldn't it be nice if for a few months we could actually just ship our goods straight over the pole to Europe and not worry about all this? The perspective on how you look at this issue, of course, really does depend on, well, where you're looking from. And I think that the question of the Chinese being up in the Arctic, looking around, trying to figure out what's going on, is not a surprise. It would be a potentially very useful trade route if it was useful for at least a few months in the future. All of this suggests that we need to stop and think about what is causing these changes. This is a lovely book cover, and if you haven't read it, it's now getting a few years old, but it's still very, very good, on how we created the Anthropocene, both the change in the world system, but also the science whereby we piece the bits and pieces together to understand that now human fingerprints are all over the climate system, as well as the other dimensions of the Earth system. And we need to stop and think very clearly and carefully about the implications of this, particularly if we're worried about security, and how it is that in these new circumstances we might now think about it. And I have been shamelessly self-promoting this book because that's exactly what I try to do. I'm trying to think about how it is that we now need to reconfigure our thought processes. Mostly security studies have taken the geography of the planet as a given backdrop over which geopolitical rivalries and arms races and things may happen. But the assumption about a basic stable geographical setting has undergirded most of security thinking. But that assumption increasingly doesn't hold in this new world, where rapidly changing environments are now the new norm. In recent years, people have been grappling with how to actually focus in on this. A recent publication from Stanford University Press is grappling with this. Planetary Thinking for an Age of Crises is the subtitle. The title, The Children of a Modest Star, is a reference to an Auden poem from a long way back, but they like the title. What matters is the subtitle here, The Planetary Thinking for an Age of Crises. Because, of course, the big discussion about the Anthropocene requires us to understand humanity as an active forcing agent, an active participant in the Earth system. We are not on Earth, we are Earth, and an increasingly significant part of how the Earth works is human activity. And we need to change our understanding of our place in the universe to understand that we, as or at least the industrial fossil fuel part of humanity, is dramatically changing how the Earth system works in all sorts of ways. And it seems to me that we need to focus in on that new understanding of the dynamics of the planet, but also on the clear implication that we are making the future. The US military like to talk about shaping the future. in terms of preparing battle spaces and diplomatic initiatives and so on. We are deciding inadvertently on the configuration of the future in terms of the climate and much else by what kinds of actions we actually take in current days. What I've been trying to do in my most recent book, and thanks again, Caesar, for the plug, is focus in on the crucial geophysical consequences of that chemistry process at the heart of all this, which is, of course, combustion. Because climate change is predominantly, not solely, but predominantly driven by our use of fossil fuels, by literally burning things. And ironically, one of the symptoms of this increase in carbon dioxide, in particular in the atmosphere, is that more things are burning, hence the cover image on this book. So climate change is both caused by the burning of fossil fuels, but one of the symptoms of it is more burning, particularly of landscapes where there are lots of trees. Wildfire is a major issue, as Canadians know, but it's increasingly a problem in other parts of the world too, because it's endangering ecosystems and in many cases human habitation, disrupting economies in numerous places too. And so we need to stop and focus on that, particularly on the power that fire gives us, which is just a convoluted way of saying firepower, because what is really at the heart of both security thinking in military terms, but also climate change in civilian terms, is fire. And how it is that fire is used or not used is a crux of both international security issues, and I would argue now climate security very much so as well, which is why my title here suggests that we're actually addicted, or at least we have an impulse control disorder in terms of how we handle fire. Hence, Pyromania is an appropriate title for a book that tries to make those kinds of arguments. If we think about fire and security and think about how it is that militaries in particular use fire in terms of weapons of destruction, but also the fuel that powers military systems, the graphic from a little while ago about how much jet fuel and explosives and other things were being used in the Gaza conflict suggests that this is something that it goes to the heart of military activity. Clearly here, the vast majority of the carbon emissions from the war comes from airplanes, both the US supplying Israelis with munitions and other equipment, as well as the Israelis actually flying large numbers of sorties in the bombing of Gaza. The munitions, yes, are also generating various carbon related emissions. Just the simple matter of explosives exploding gives you carbon dioxide, as well as some other chemicals, some of which are very noxious. But the point is that modern militaries too are major emitters, and that needs to be taken into consideration. But it also, for me, provides a direct link between how we think about fuel and how we think about firepower in the traditional military, because the power that fire and fuel gives us is at the heart of military missions just as much. In fact, in this graphics case, much more than the amount of emissions that we're actually getting from the use of munitions themselves. All of which suggests a twist on how we've traditionally thought about these things, which seems to me to be crucial in terms of how we think about peace going forward. What kind of security do we need? Well, it's clearly one that uses a heck of a lot less firepower in both senses. Beyond that, back to the point I made about Tom Delianis's comment in that volume back at the beginning of my talk, that we need to think about not just climate change, but the other transformations that are happening. This is a recent piece in PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, Note, please, it's open access. You don't need a subscription or anything. You can simply download it straight from the website. Google the title and away you go. The crucial point on this is to suggest that there are all sorts of tipping points and dangerous moments at which we are approaching, and we need to change course quite dramatically. I've already mentioned the Arctic stuff, abrupt sea ice loss in the Barents Sea, the possibility of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation ceasing, which would have dramatic short-term climate effects on Europe, making it much colder very quickly, because basically the Gulf Stream would stop flowing across the Atlantic, keeping Europe, relatively speaking, warm for its latitude. That might also trigger a collapse on the Labrador Current and numerous other disruptions. If suddenly Europe is plunged from heat waves to being much, much colder, its agricultural system is going to get dramatically disrupted. And with that will go a whole lot of major economic disruptions, with all sorts of unpredictable knock-on effects around the world. And it's this kind of dramatic transformation that has the climate scientists particularly worried. And it is that we would like to avoid many of these things dramatically changing, because we do know that we can have a functional civilization in a relatively stable climate that we've known for most of the last 10,000 years. What we don't have any clear sense is a rapidly fluctuating, unpredictable climate will allow us to feed 9 billion people in any kind of stable, sensible security going forward. But it does require us to rethink globally what resources are about. And yes, I'm violating the basic rule: never give anybody on a PowerPoint presentation a lot of text to read. But here goes. The planetary commons will require moving away from a global commons as a means of governing resource use of natural resources beyond national borders to universal rules of how to collectively secure critical biophysical Earth system functions that regulate livability on Earth for everyone, irrespective of where these functions are located. We are in an interconnected world where there are key biophysical functions, including all of those that were on that previous map. That's what we now need to secure. And this is a long stretch from what traditional notions of climate and security have actually been focusing on. And it's this change in perspective that comes from thinking in planetarity terms. We've got to understand ourselves as part of a dynamic system, not living on Earth. And of course, it's that fundamental shift that is at the heart of the Anthropocene discussion. One of the other things that goes with this, of course, is given the fact we're already in the age of consequences, we do need to think about the necessity of acting quickly on all of this. Because the nightmare scenario on this is if we keep prevaricating, oh, it's for the future, we'll deal with it later, that's for the next budget cycle, or we've got an immediate crisis in the Ukraine or the Sudan or wherever, which we have to attend to, the climate can wait till next year. The analysis here is saying that may actually be a fatal mistake, because there may be circumstances coming if we don't act that will focus our attention so much on the short term, so much on the immediate disaster recovery and response and recovery, that there simply aren't resources available to ensure that we can make a transition to a post-carbon fueled world. Derailing the policy, derailing the climate change response is what is being focused on in this particular paper. And again, it's open access, so everybody can access it easily. The point about this is that if increasing disasters happen, more floods, think Porto Alegre in Brazil, facing another flood in the next day or two. Think about the health impacts of things like ever increasing temperatures in Saudi, diverting resources away from investing in new energy systems, diverting resources away from building sensibly. diverting of resources away from the long-term thinking to the immediate disaster response. And in the worst case scenario, actually firing up coal-powered plants to provide electricity to keep things running in the middle of disruptions, adding yet more carbon dioxide and more long-term hazards. So the urgency of this is that we may not have that much time. If we wait too long, we may not be able to respond appropriately to make a more sustainable and hence hopefully more peaceful future. Well, it turns out that one of the suggestions about how to tackle that future links up fairly obviously with other things that the security sector has known how to do. Non-proliferation treaty, that may sound like familiar. We have nuclear non-proliferation treaties and various other forms of arms control. And of course, if we are serious about constraining greenhouse gas emissions, we simply have to constrain the production of fossil fuel and do so quickly. And so recently, a series of proposals have appeared suggesting that we can model some of the key elements of what's now simply called supply side policy to complement the demand side, which we've been focusing on reducing emissions. Let's focus on reducing the production of fossil fuel in the first place. And of course, this is neatly parallel with arms control treaty ideas. The whole idea is you stop producing weapons, therefore you don't have the dangers of them being used. If you stop producing fossil fuel, you don't have the dangers of fossil fuel generated climate change disruptions. Supply side thinking seriously about keeping it in the ground, to use the hashtag, is now emerging as a complementary series of policy initiatives, which draws on some of the thinking from security studies in a completely different way from the old debate about whether climate causes conflict. It's much easier if you want to monitor climate change activities to count tankers, pipelines, trucks and refineries than it is to try and measure emissions, which are a much more nebulous and difficult technical task. So if we can get some treaties in terms of restricting production of fossil fuels, this fits nicely with national technical means, as it used to be called in arms control, monitoring global shipments and so on. So there's an obvious way to link up traditional arms control with what I insist these days on simply calling fuel control, because the parallels, it seems to me, are direct, both technically in terms of how you do this stuff, but also in terms of the common dangers from both weapons and fossil fuels, both of which are threatening to burn lots of things. Looming in the distance, of course, is one of the other things that we need to stop and think about how to control, to constrain, to govern, because just a reminder here, the Arctic, when it's icy, reflects a lot of sunshine. And as you can see in the middle of this picture, when there's open water, it actually absorbs a whole lot more heat. So one of the suggestions that's been kicking around in terms of geoengineering is, can technical means be used to refreeze the Arctic, hence increase the amount of sunshine in summer being reflected off? It may cause headaches for our friendly shipping broker in Shanghai looking for a new route, but it might actually help slow down and reduce the risks of climate disruption if we could figure out ways to actually increase the amount of ice cover over the Arctic. But the Chinese might be very annoyed that their trade route is being interrupted by these crazy Canadians that want to put more ice back in the Arctic. So we need to think about the international implications of geoengineering too. And it's one of the issues that clearly matters in terms of who does what in the Arctic. And there are, of course, some interesting proposals to refreeze the Arctic. Don't ask me about the technical details of the engineering here. I'm just using the graphic to make the point that people are seriously thinking about how you might refreeze the Arctic. This looks like a solar-powered refrigeration system to generate little hexagons of ice and cover chunks of the Arctic with them. The point here is not the technical details, but it's the whole idea of refreezing the Arctic thinking about that as a major effort for geoengineering in future years, because this is indeed the kind of thing that will need governance in the future. And of course, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine a couple of years ago, the Arctic Council, with a substantial, important contribution from the indigenous folks as well around the Arctic, was a relatively user-friendly, productive set of international discussions, leading to all sorts of cooperation in the Arctic. This is the kind of thing that we will need to stop and think long and hard about, because if people are serious about trying to refreeze the Arctic, it may be seen as a threat by some, it may be seen as an opportunity by others, but getting some clear governance rules working in advance of serious engineering of this kind is absolutely crucial to peace and security. It is in arms control terms, sort of confidence building measures in advance of deployment. And I think once again, we can see this kind of thing in traditional security terms quite easily. So by way of conclusion, seeing as my time is up, let me leave you with a couple of suggestions following on from taking planetarity seriously. All a lot easier when the wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and Sudan stop, of course. But if we understand the Arctic as one of those planetary commons that the paper I showed you earlier was suggesting, maybe there are some actually models for an Arctic treaty that extend some of the ideas about demilitarized zones and from the Antarctica, but also extend the notions that there will be no resource extraction from Antarctica, just scientific work down there. Can we do the same thing? Well, the Canadians have already said that there'll be a moratorium on Arctic drilling quite a few years ago, did an update of that last year. Can that be extended right across the whole region? Might that be a useful initiative to keep oil in the ground for climate reasons, but also reduce the potential pollution hazards of exploration and exploitation of fossil fuels in the Arctic? We do have the old Gorbachev ideas from the weapons-free zone, the zone of peace. Going back to the 1980s, can we revive that? And a rejuvenated Arctic Council might be able to do that. We do need to stop and think about geoengineering agreements and try to get some governance on that before people start doing large-scale experiments, particularly in that Arctic. And might the recent High Seas Treaty give us some models about extending the discussions of that to the Arctic, because the ice is melting? One of the most interesting PhD dissertations out of the Balsillie School, where I used to teach a few years ago, was Tony Pryor's one on the Arctic. And of course, the crux of that whole issue is it water or is it solid? And if so, which governance mechanisms are appropriate? Because ice has very different qualities than water, not only in climate terms. And so this kind of dynamic, unpredictable environment makes governance focus on how to tackle dramatic, dynamic places in a way that's consistent with understanding more generally how we now need to think about our place in this new era of the Anthropocene. Thank you very much for your attention.